So I was born in a small town called Anchor Bay, which is on the north coast of California. And Anchor Bay is a small community between Mendocino and Fort Bragg. And it's part of a kind of a region, I would say, of artists and makers and craftsmen that migrated and left the Bay Area in the 60s and 70s and landed in kind of the more rural parts of Northern California. Mm-hmm. And my parents were part of that community and that group that migrated from the Bay Area up to Northern California along the coast. And so my kind of foundational background and history is coming from more of a rural setting in that sense. And
you said it was a community of artists and other things?
Yeah, in the 60s and 70s, the north coast of California became kind of a refuge for artists, sculptors, builders, carpenters, became kind of a refuge from the kind of the urban Bay Area scene. And so it wasn't specifically one community kind of amongst the trees, but it was definitely a series of neighborhoods and communities and people kind of spread along the coast. Probably the most well-known of the cohort is an artist, J.B. Blunk, who does a lot of kind of woodworking and sculpture. And so from there, the community was really about making and engaging with kind of the process of making something or creating something. And so I was born into that whole kind of world. And my dad is a classically trained carpenter and builder. Cool. He trained in Japan. And so his work when I was born was really focused on woodworking and Japanese joinery and timber framing. And so he built our house that we lived in when I was a kid. And so I was really engaged in that world right from the very beginning.
So you said your dad studied woodworking in Japan.
He did.
That's crazy.
In the 70s. And I was talking with him the other day, and we're going to go to Japan next spring and visit some of his kind of old mentors and people that he used to work with. So we're really excited to go do that. But it's an interesting story because he kind of went to Japan on a whim to discover something. I don't think he knew exactly what, but in that he got connected with a master temple builder who built projects for in the late 19th century, early 20th century, built projects for the Emperor of Japan.
Wow.
And so he was kind of part of that whole world essentially as an apprentice. He knew no Japanese and they knew no English. So it was very much a visual tradition of communicating how to do something.
That's super cool.
So that for him was really an inspiring thing. And he brought that back to California with him in the late 70s and started to develop a company as a small entrepreneur business owner, develop a company based on that whole ethos within for Northern California. So it was an interesting world to be brought into in that sense.
Yeah, I'm sure that craftsmanship is of the utmost importance in that kind of way of practicing. It's not let's bang something together and get it done and then on to the next.
It was not that. And I think one of the interesting things that I have kind of taken from that in a certain sense is that there was a real importance to each piece of the construction that you are working on, and I think in part because Japan was historically, and I think still is, there's kind of a limited set of resources there. And so it became very important then if they are going to use a tree, the tree that they use has, they're treating it with a really high level of care, I guess.
So did he end up practicing as a carpenter and he had his own business? So was he, I guess, building houses in the residential space or?
He was building some houses in up and down the coast there, including in Sea Ranch, and which is an iconic, planned community on the coast there. Really incredible area to visit. And then he was also working on a few kind of public or semi-public projects, including the construction of the Sea Ranch Chapel, which was designed by an artist coming out of Southern California, and then built by my father and his team. And it's a really interesting. He was telling me about it the other day, and it's something where the artist, his name's Jim Hubble. He's still around, and he didn't do any drawings. He built a physical model, like a sculpture essentially. And then they would be on site and they would be holding the model up and then looking at the building in the distance that has been framed out. Right. So it was a very kind of analog one-to-one way of working.
That's interesting. There's a few things with that. One, it's when I think of Japanese craftsmanship and joinery and carpentry, I automatically think that there's somewhat of a disconnect between that level versus what a lot of what gets built in the United States, especially with houses and any other type of building. So it's intriguing that I think it's great that people would actually hire someone who knows what they're doing to execute something probably at an extremely, extremely high level, which again, you just don't see very often. I mean, it's hard to convince people to build something that's of decent quality, let alone probably what your dad was doing.
Well, it goes back to the whole craftsmanship aspect of any profession that's just, I think, getting lost more and more these days. It's something that we just don't value as much as it used to.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that less and less as architects, we have an opportunity to work on projects that will be around for over 100 years.
Yeah.
The life cycle is pretty challenging in that sense. I mean, some of the big public projects, they will survive, but I think when you talk about sustainability and other things, I feel like there's not a huge discussion about building lifespan. It's more about kind of the front end. What's the embodied carbon of the material, yada, 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 right? All that. And I don't think there's a huge amount of discussion about how long buildings last, which is kind of interesting. I'm not really that engaged in that part of the world. But I think there's something there that is worth thinking about.
I think that's a really good point, for sure. And just to touch on that real quick, I do sometimes feel like in the architecture realm, when we talk about sustainability, being energy efficient and all these things, there's a tendency for a lot of people to focus on maybe the flashier elements of components of how to achieve that versus I sometimes feel like we're just making it too complicated. I mean, I'm all for green technology and we should incorporate it, but it's like, how about you place the window where it should be, and how about you don't have a bunch of glazing facing west if you're not in the right climate for it? How about you do just basic things and that'll solve 50%, and then you don't need all of this tech to hold up the house in terms of energy.
Yeah, I think there's some best practices that we can all just adhere to as a starting point, which I think is that's where I start with all of it. And so I think looking at growing up within this world, and our world was and my world was, starting at probably 7 or 8, I was helping in the shop, right? I had a broom, I was helping him move things. So I was really kind of part of that, that whole scene. And so I think as I grew up a little bit, And my mom, for her part, she went to UC Berkeley for an art degree. And while she didn't pursue it professionally, she always had that kind of aesthetic mindset in terms of thinking about the world through an artistic lens. And so as I made my way into high school, it became really clear that architecture was the kind of, the union of those two things. And it became really clear that that was what I was supposed to be doing. Right. And the high school that I went to, we're very fortunate enough to have a series of essentially shop classes. And I don't know if that's a thing that is currently part of high school, but I think it was a really valuable experience for many of my peers. But, I was able to take a drafting class and a metalworking class where I learned how to weld. And so there was something really interesting about being able to start to think using your hands and kind of move out of the kind of academic, AP classes and things like that into a world of let's design something and think about something, and then let's figure out how to put that together.
It is a different way of thinking, and it's kind of, I suppose, if you like it, it's refreshing, and it's tangible. It also taps into a lot of, I think it forces you to think in a lot of different dimensions as opposed to just the equation that's in front of you on the paper. And in my view, of course, I'm biased. Did you have a woodworking class, a shop?
So I didn't take shop in high school because that was at home, right? My dad had a shop. And that was where all that was.
I was going to say, if you did, I bet you just like schooled everyone in the class and they're like, who is this kid and why are you even taking this class?
That was all at home. But my parents, for their part, were very, very supportive of what I was trying to do and what I wanted to do. And so in addition to the kind of more practical hands-on classes, I was also taking art classes and exploring that part of the creative process. Even things like creative writing, right? And other ways of expressing myself. It was all part of that really early pursuit of what it means to be a creative and to find outlets and ways to express oneself.
Do you feel like those varied and different experiences somehow channeled themselves into what has made you a good and successful architect?
100%. I think that my whole goal or approach, or if someone asks me for advice about where I look for things, I'm always looking outside of architecture as a profession for inspiration. And it's I think so important to continue to do that, both as a student, but also as a working professional all the way through, because there's so much inspiration that we can pull from artists, writers, even the land and nature and things that are a little bit more, I guess, organic in the way that they've developed. But looking just at architecture, I think in my personal view, is much too limiting.
That's an interesting take, and actually, it's one that I agree with. Where my headspace was at just now is, we get asked by a lot of aspiring architects, and sometimes kids who are in high school, which weirds me out that a 14-year-old is DMing us on Instagram, but they're asking like, what can I do to prepare to become, the next greatest architect? And most people, they jump to the conclusion of, I have to take architecture classes, study architectural history, study about facades, study classical architecture, all those things.
Learn Revit.
And of course, and learn Revit always is like, everyone says that. And there's truth to all those things for sure. And anyone who goes to study architecture is probably going to cover all of those things. But My general advice to someone who's in high school is just take anything where it's a creative process toward a project, toward a final thing. It doesn't matter if it's writing. Sometimes I tell people writing, or if it's sculpture. Obviously, that's more relatable to architecture, or it's painting. But something where you have to go through a process on your own and create something for an end finished thing. And sometimes people think I'm wacko for saying that, but in my experience, it's just fuel for the future rocket. It's just energy for what's going to come later. Is how I would best describe it.
I completely agree. And I think that the beautiful thing about architecture is that there's room for everyone, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I have a lot of great friends that are very technical, and they nerd out about the way that the waterproofing is working and part of an envelope detail, on a high rise. And I love that for them, right? That's not who I am as an architect, but I do think that the profession at large has so much space in it for and need for all of those. That said, I do think it's important that people are educating themselves broadly so they have context for the decisions that they're making.
Yeah, that's super well put. So do you remember what age when you decided that architecture was going to be the thing you were going to study in college? Were you 14, 12, 10, 17 when you have to decide before you apply?
35?
It was midway through high school.
Yeah.
And it was a decision that was kind of made for me in a certain sense, but it was a very conscious decision. I was definitely not checking a box on a form. And it was a conscious decision. And at that point in time, we were living in Santa Cruz. And so Santa Cruz is a, beautiful coastal small town just south of San Francisco. And so I was, really into the outdoors, really into surfing, really into, being a part of the scene in Northern California, and also being an architect and being able to use my, what I felt was my creative abilities to, build things in the real world, or design things to be built in the real world. So in high school, I decided that I wanted to be an architect. And I also decided that there was only one school that I could go to, that I could go surf and also go and have a really, high level of education, and also be in Northern California, basically. Central California.
There's not many options there.
That sounds like
and that was Cal Poly in San Luis Obispo. So there was only really one school. So I only applied to one school and one major, and that was it.
Wow.
And so I kind of knew.
It's a tough school to get into too. That's pretty ballsy.
It was a tough school to get into, and by way of demonstration, I didn't get in.
Oh, okay.
Oh no.
So what that meant, and actually I think it was a huge benefit to me long term, but I did get in. So I stayed in Santa Cruz, and I took all my GEs at community college, which was a great community college, locally. And at the same time, I was working for an architect in Santa Cruz. Oh, and so I was able to get all my GEs done and finished.
Oh, cheater.
And I was able to get work experience.
Yeah. That's an interesting route. I mean, a lot of people go through that, but I've never thought about it quite in that way, where you're able to take the pressure off of GEs when you're in undergrad, because GEs are great. I mean, I love the GE classes I took at Cal Poly, but sometimes they suck when you just want to work in studio.
Yeah, it drains your focus in a certain way. So by doing that, when I finally made it to Cal Poly 3 years later, I started as a 22-year-old freshman.
Wow.
Did you have to start in year
program.
1? Oh, I guess so, right? Because it wasn't okay, interesting.
Yep. Started as a 22-year-old freshman.
So you were the older guy in the class.
You're right. Yeah. Exactly. I was the older one in the class, and there were a few others as well. But the great thing about it was, yes, it took longer, but I could basically only take my major classes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a few other little classes I had to take, but basically it was only taking architecture classes.
Mm-hmm.
And then it also allowed me time to get a minor in fine art. So
cool.
It was just a really good 5-year experience once I made it to undergrad. And I was able to think about architecture and study architecture pretty much exclusively, and then balance that out with my fine art degree. So I was painting, and I was in the glass blowing studio, and I was taking art history classes. So it took 7.5 years, start to finish, to get an undergrad degree. But looking back, I definitely don't regret that path that I took.
So a few questions. One kind of tangent is that we'll have to talk about this more maybe after the interview.
Yeah.
But I think I know someone who had your dad do some work on one of their projects in somewhere in either Northern California or Oregon. I can't recall. I can't imagine there's that many Japanese woodworking folks on the West Coast.
No, I don't think so.
So that's that. But the more important question is, prior to going to Cal Poly, did you have any ideas or preconceptions of what architecture or architecture school was going to be like that were corrected when you got to Cal Poly? Was there anything different during that transition? You realized, oh, this is different from what I thought it was going to be.
Great question. I think that initially I was trying to approach it very wide open and not have a kind of a preconceived notion of what I was getting myself into. So, you would hear people say, oh, it's a lot of work, or it's really intense. So I had an understanding of that. And a family friend was a professor at Cal Poly in the structural engineering department. So I had some conversations with him about it. And so I had a sense generally, but I think with the 3 years in community college as a transition, it softened the blow of college to some extent. So I think my experience was maybe a little bit atypical in that sense. But nothing, once I landed in San Luis Obispo and started, nothing was, shocking or surprising or, completely different than what I had anticipated.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think coming in open-minded is probably the best approach. I've seen a lot of people, and I'm sure you have too, even at Cal Poly, where folks come into the school or any architecture school thinking it's going to be a lot more engineering, mathematics, and technical, the school part at least. And then, some of your first assignments are like, here, take some toothpicks and define your identity, and people's heads explode. They're like, how does this relate to, concrete foundations? And they can't get past the first 2 years, because the first 2 years maybe it's changed, I don't know, but tend to be fairly they're very abstract, in some cases, and very conceptual, and it freaks people out.
But I think that's a good thing. I think it should be, because if you started with the kind of technical side of the work, I think back to our earlier things we were talking about, you don't have the broad understanding of why you're doing something.
Yeah.
And so I think establishing the why of, why are you thinking about point and line and space, and why are we doing all these things? I think that's a really critical part of both from an educational standpoint, but even as people go out into the world, into the profession, I think you need to be thinking about why you're doing something.
Yeah. That's super well said. So the other question I want to ask, which is something that our listeners ask us a lot, but I'm not able to answer because I don't have a master's in architecture, is you did a master's in architecture, right, at UCLA. Why did you decide to get a master's in architecture when you already had a B-Arch, which means, for people who don't know, that you could have gotten licensed and you did not actually need to get a master's for licensing purposes? Like, this is the question we always get asked. I'm like, I don't know. But
I think it was a number of factors. And, my story is mine, but I do think there's some things from it that can maybe answer some of those questions. I think that, for me, as I was graduating from undergrad, I was graduating into kind of the tail end of the Great Recession in 2009, 2010. So brutal. It wasn't looking that great out there in the professional world. And then Cal Poly and other schools do it too, because now West of West is hosting students in this way, but they do essentially like a spring break work program that they have a number of different firms. So in your final year of school in the spring, the week that you have off for spring break, you can go work somewhere to get a sense of what the profession is like. And many students hadn't done that before. They purely went from high school to college to having really no understanding of what working as an architect was like. So the schools like Cal Poly and others that do this spring break program, I think it's a really valuable way for students to be able to understand the profession, at least in some context. Yeah. So for me, when I did that, my 5th year of Cal Poly, I ended up at Morphosis down in LA.
Oh, not a bad gig.
and completely fell in love with it. The kind of the attitude, the team, the projects that we were working on. And so even after just being there for a week, it was something that it really resonated with me. And so after graduating, kind of at the end of the year, Kim Groves, who was a principal at Morphosis at the time, who's a Cal Poly alum, we were talking and she was suggesting that I come and do an internship there over the summer. So I went from graduating, and then a week later I moved to LA and did an internship for them. And in that time, I was also applying to grad schools. And so I knew that in the kind of the group and the scene that I was within in undergrad, everyone was very ambitious, and everybody kind of implicitly was considering a graduate degree. And for me or for us with a 5-year degree, some programs are just a year. Yeah. So it's not a 3-year or 2 or 3 year haul to get a graduate degree. Yeah.
Was UCLA 1 year?
So UCLA was 1 year.
Yeah, that's nice.
And so I went and applied to a variety of different schools, Harvard, Columbia, UCLA. Harvard said no, Columbia said yes, UCLA said yes. I went to Columbia, and I have a lot of friends that have been there, went there, and it just wasn't the right fit for me personally. It's an amazing school, but it just didn't really align with what I was looking for. It felt like an extension of my undergraduate education in the way that they had organized the curriculum.
Like it would have been UCLA, a little bit more of the same happening again for another year, for another 2 semesters.
It was a little bit more of the same in that sense, where you have kind of a rotating quarter over quarter system of studios and research seminars and things like that. So for me, it wasn't exactly what I was looking for. So I think to your initial point, or initial question, I guess, David, the reason that someone should be going to grad school is to have an experience that's different than what they had in undergrad. I think that's really, really critical. If you use grad school as simply an extension of undergrad, I think you're missing some opportunities.
Yeah, I agree. That makes total sense. And if you feel like you need more undergrad, I don't know. After 5 years of the course system, I don't know why you would need more undergrad. Yeah. I was there for 6.
You don't want to get out in the world.
No, that's super well said. So you go to UCLA. I was wondering. So at Cal Poly, did you do the LA Metro program?
So I had the professor Stephen Phillips that's running the LA Metro program currently,
Yeah.
but this was pre LA Metro.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Just because the narrative sounds like you would have been one of the students to go there.
Yeah, we did end up doing. I was in his 5th year studio, and we did end up doing our like year-end crit was at a gallery in LA. So
cool.
He was starting to, even at that point, be realizing that as kind of quaint and beautiful as San Luis Obispo is, it is limited in some sense in terms of architectural, the architectural world and engagement with culture at large. So
yeah, true. Okay, so I forget in the story, did you have a gap year between undergrad and grad school, or did you go straight from Cal Poly to UCLA?
Straight, yeah, it was straight through.
Okay,
and that was for UCLA. It was working at Morphosis in the summer, and then going straight into what's called the Super Studio, which is a year-long, essentially a research seminar that was led by Tom Main and his co-professor, a German woman named Karen Lorman, who was great, and she very much had like an arts focus. And that is something that I had no idea what I was getting into. Talk about no understanding of what we were going to be doing or what the final kind of result was going to be 9 months later. It was a great period of time, but we didn't design a building. Didn't even think about architecture.
Let's hear about it then. I'm very intrigued. What does that even mean?
So what we were focused on was leveraging public arts funding to use arts and culture programs to positively impact mid-sized American cities. And Tom Main at the time was on the President's Council for the Arts and Humanities, which was an Obama program that it's still around today, but he was an Obama appointee to that. So he was really, really excited about using that network and thinking about how art can and public arts funding can positively impact cities that a lot of them that we were looking at were kind of post-industrial cities, like Flint and Cleveland, and then some were Sunbelt cities. And the whole year was kind of foundational research. And it was looking at both from a kind of a qualitative and a quantitative level, what is working in these cities, what's not working in these cities, as a way of forming questions, which Tom is huge about problem formation. That's kind of, if you were going to, I think, define him in a certain sense, that is really what he is about. And so the whole year was essentially about looking at these cities and forming questions and establishing what the problems would be. And then at the very end, we were looking at kind of almost like urban level solutions to things.
Was it part of I forget the name, but the UCLA school is not strictly just architecture. It's like architecture and urban design or something like that, right?
Yeah, AUD, architecture and urban design.
Right. Gotcha.
So there was some kind of connection there, and this studio for Tom was an extension of his LA Now studios, which were very much about urban, form making and urban projects.
Did you have an interest in urban design and urban thinking and questions prior to this experience?
I generally, Not specifically. I think that I kind of have always been interested in all different scales of how we can think creatively as architects about the world around us.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not an urbanist, and I was not trying to be an urbanist in that sense.
Yeah. I mean, I personally think that it's a very important thing for someone, if they take 5 years of architecture school or even 4 years, to at some point in their academic career have some studies and courses or something about urban design, urban research at the urban scale. I think it's kind of silly, honestly, to go through studying architecture and not at least touch on these things in like a dedicated class. And that was something I felt was lacking, frankly, from my experience in SLO, was like there wasn't any conversation sincerely about urban design things, more than just a blip in one lecture. And I never quite understood it, because it seems to me, and maybe this gets to a lot of your work that you do now, that when you're doing any work, but especially public-facing work, it kind of starts with the urban questions before anything else in a lot of ways. And then the building comes sometimes as a result of that.
I think it's really important that we're looking outside the property line.
Yeah.
And if we're not looking outside the specific area that we have influence over, I think 99% of the time it's a missed opportunity.
So you finish UCLA and you work at Morphosis, right?
So from there, yeah. And to back the story up a little bit, which ties into West of West and where we are now, at Cal Poly is where I met Clayton Taylor, who I founded West of West with. And he and I started working kind of collaboratively as we shared studio space and went to Europe, and kind of were discovering parts of architecture kind of at the same time. And so our working relationship started at Cal Poly and then continued through UCLA. We both went to the same program, same super studio with Tom.
Oh, cool.
And worked together there as well. So we started that working relationship in 2008, 2007.
Mm-hmm. So, did you both work at Morphosis afterwards?
And then, so from there, from UCLA, we both went into the studio at Morphosis, and I stayed on, and he left to go work at a firm called Rios in LA.
Yeah, both amazing offices. Yeah.
For the next 4 years, we kind of had a really interesting dichotomy of those two different offices. And we were talking together on the weekends and, having discussions about practice and what works and what doesn't work. So it was an interesting kind of extension of our education in a sense.
So at what point did you guys want to, you know what, we should just start our own thing?
There's a little bit of attitude.
That is the question. That is the question.
You know what?
These offices, they're great, but I think we should do our own.
Doesn't have to be the motive, but okay, yeah.
It I think was born out of really a shared love of working collaboratively and working together on projects, and for us, when we started, it was very much a leap of faith. And it was something where the first project that we had was one that was a small project. And we had been talking a lot about if we were going to have a practice, what it would be like and why. And so when this first project came up as an opportunity, I decided to leave Morphosis to go pursue that. And Clay stayed at Rios for, I think, 6 more months potentially. And then he also left and joined me. And for a long time, we were very much kind of, it was just the two of us, and we were working on little things. But Marina, to answer your question specifically, I can't point to a specific reason, but I felt like it was almost kind of an instinctive choice to try it. And I think that really was an important part of our decision making was the need to try. And if we failed, that's fine. We can go do other things. We have a lot of time left. At that point, I was, I think, 30, 31. And so we had plenty of time to go and do something else if this failed, if this didn't work. So it was really kind of within that context that we were thinking about West of West.
So it's not like you had like a business plan. Okay, when we turn 31, we're going to quit our job.
Nobody has a business plan. That's not how it
works. but when you guys got that first project, did you even, people say you have to have a business plan when you start your own business and this and that, but I feel like it never really happens that way. It just kind of like happens more organically, or you have the passion, or like you say, you kind of just want to go for it and see if it works out or if it doesn't.
Feeling.
Yeah. It's not, especially architecture, because it's a creative field. I feel like a lot of times you start not for like a business reason. It's much more for like a passion for creating.
And then you realize the business reason has to be part of the conversation.
Plan,
it's definitely something that in school you have zero training for.
Yeah.
And so, even if at that point in time you asked me, "Hey, Jai, where's your business plan?" I wouldn't know what you were talking about.
Yeah. I mean, business
plan to put it together.
The plan is to get work and do work. That's the plan.
Yeah, I mean, and I think it was driven just by an interest and a passion to create something that was our own.
Yeah.
And that was the starting point. And then everything else, even up till now, is figuring out how to do that in a way that is responsible.
Yeah.
I'm curious, back in your school days, did you guys joke with each other that sometime in the future you would have your own practice, as a lot of students do?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent we knew that working together was there was something powerful to it, and we enjoyed it, and the results were kind of more than what one of us was working kind of independently would be. And so it really evolved over a number of years in terms of talking about it, thinking about it. It was not necessarily just like a snap judgment. And Clay and I, by that point, when we started West of West, we knew each other like so well. And there was no, there were no surprises. And so forming partnerships, is something that it has risks, but I think if you're doing it in a way where you really know the other person, I think there's a lot of value to a partnership in that sense.
Do you remember what that first project was?
Yeah, the first project was a store called Garrett Light California Optical. On La Brea. So it's on La Brea, between 2nd and 3rd, I think.
Cool.
Mid-city, Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And Garrett and I, Garrett was a roommate of mine in college. Cal Poly. So he went to Cal Poly.
He went to Cal Poly. So my glasses are Garrett Lights. I had no idea that Garrett, which Mr. Light is how I know him, went to. Okay. I'm trying to wrap my brain around this. It's so funny.
Sorry, we can rewind back.
No, not at all. It's just because I know them as a brand, obviously, but for some reason, I guess when you know a brand and you like what they do, you just think of them as being. I imagined
it's abstract. Right?
I imagine Garrett Light to be some 65-year-old, very established, like wealthy. I don't know, a guy with boat shoes on a yacht. I don't know.
Yeah. His dad is Larry Light. Larry Light was one of the people that started Oliver Peoples.
Okay.
We kind of in a kind of strange parallel. Like he started Garrett Light out of his dad's work in some sense, and I started West of West. Kind of as an extension of what my dad was working on as well.
Right.
So there's some interesting parallel there, but Garrett and I were roommates in college for a year approximately. And so he called me one day, and he's from LA. And he called me one day, and he was just starting this brand. And he started it by kind of selling samples from old old Oliver Peoples and other kind of eyewear that his dad had kind of had around the house and in the garage. And there was a little bit of like there was a scene around it a little bit. He had a little store on Abbot Kinney. And so he decided to try to like really make it a thing and take the leap. And so he called me and was like, hey, I just signed a lease and I need to move in 2 months. But can you help me design the store?
Can you help me? Just help. Yeah.
And I said yes. And I think that the naivete or the ability to say yes to things without overthinking it, I think is obviously there's some danger to it, but I think there's something really powerful also about just saying yes and then figuring it out and having the faith that you as an architect, you have a level of skill that you can do that thing. And so we said yes. And so we designed the store in, I don't know, 10 days and pitched it, and he loved it. And he found a contractor, and we would go by every single day and look at the work. And even to the point where the contractor would, needed like full scale templates to build this wall that had kind of a curve to it. And so we were like going to the plotters and plotting full-size templates and bringing them to the contractor. And it was very much a hands-on experience for us.
It sounds like a vellum project or something.
Totally. Absolutely. It was very much like, cool, let's make it happen. Let's figure out a way to do it. And so that first project then kind of led to others. And with Garrett specifically, it has led to now a 10 plus year, working relationship.
Wow. That's awesome.
And we've done every store, but he has one store in Canada that we haven't done, but we've done every other physical thing for him.
Oh, okay. I should have known that. I think I did know that. So you guys did the store in SF in San Francisco?
We did the store in San Francisco.
Yeah. I've been to a number of their stores and I've always admired them. And it wasn't until recently I made that connection between you and them, but it's like, someone designed this store. Like someone spent some time thinking about this. This is well done. And I recall in one of the, I don't know if you're related to this at all, but in one of the stores, there's a display shelf with 3D printed models. And I remember thinking, that's very interesting that a glasses shop would have 3D printed models of,
this
I think
is
it was
like
architecture.
An
it was
move.
of buildings.
Yeah.
I'm like,
They asked us for those, actually. That was not me at all. They asked us for those.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. So that's a great story and a great project to kick off everything. So from that point until now, how long has your office been around?
9 years.
9 years? Okay. So that's quite some time. It's sort of, I don't know what it is. For architects, that's like a blip, but for everyone else, that's a long time. After that first project, did more things come across your desks, or was it slow? Like how did it happen? How did the transition from then to stability take place?
Well, stability, I think, is an overstatement. But...
As I was saying that, I'm like, yeah.
But it was a very bootstrapped, slow process. Mm-hmm. And we kind of made it that way intentionally. But, Marina, back to your point about the business plan, we didn't have a business plan. We didn't have investors. We didn't have kind of a growth strategy.
Yeah.
I was 31, 32, and we were definitely building the plane as it was flying.
Yeah.
And it led to, through our, friends and our network that we were starting to grow, it led to a series of small retail projects. And those were a kind of a vehicle for us to be exploring both externally ideas around form and materials and how an interior space, a retail store, can engage with the street and the public. Mm-hmm. And also exploring and thinking about internally, what are we as as a company, as a firm, and thinking and developing ideas there. So the kind of slow start in that sense was able to give us time to be really developing the why behind why we're designing something in a certain way, and the why behind why are we a company, and what do we exist and who do we exist for. So it was a very slow start in that sense, but it was really valuable. And I had my girlfriend at the time, now wife, was just an incredible partner in that, in being supportive along that whole process. And I think that if you're looking at starting a company, having a system around you of people that are in your corner is so critical, because the odds are definitely stacked against you in that sense. So having that support system is really valuable.
Yeah. Did you guys always know that you wanted to do more commercial work as opposed to residential, or a mix of things? Like, what was the, I guess, vision, if you had one, for the types of things you would take on or want to
We've
do?
always been really interested in how architecture can engage with and impact the public realm. And that, that happens in a number of ways, but we weren't getting museum commissions right off the bat. So we were taking kind of every approach to try to understand and explore how what we're doing can impact the public realm. And that doesn't mean just necessarily physically or architecturally, but I think it has a lot to do, and this is a through line that comes through to today, is it has a lot to do with how what we do as architects benefits or enhances the experience of someone that doesn't know about architecture. And so we've always had a practice that's focused on building projects and thinking about projects for the kind of the greater culture, the greater society, versus kind of just working in our corner and being self-referential. And we've never really had a practice that was structured in that sense. We've always really been about trying to broaden our reach and who we're impacting and benefiting their experience, whether it's something as simple as walking into a retail store, or a lobby of a building, or even driving by it on the street. So it's always really been a core part of what West of West is, and why West of West is what it is.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear that from the early days, even before you decided to start the office, that you were both, it seems to be very conscious of making sure that you were asking yourselves these pretty big questions of why are we even creating an office. And I feel that it's obviously it's important, it's nearly essential to do great work, I think, but it's also really difficult to do. And it's interesting, your story, that maybe the beginning of the office's story was a little bit slower because you took the time to think about that, versus I think what happens maybe most often is the opposite, where people get an architect gets one project and they get more and more, and then they grow. And soon there's really no time in the day or the week, or it's very hard to find it, to step back and think about, like, what are we doing here? And what was the point of all of this, other than just, taking on work and staying busy and completing things, which is hard enough, to be honest, just to do that.
Yeah, it is. But I think for Clay and I, we've really been focused on, shaping a practice that is pulling and drawing from our experiences in the professional world, at other practices, and thinking about professional practice as in a way that's looking more into the future, and thinking about how we can define and create West of West as a contemporary practice, in response in some ways to places that we had worked in the past. And I think that the core of that was answering the question, where would I want to work as an architect, not as a founder or a partner or a principal, but just, as a designer, where would I want to work? And so we've always really been focused on creating a studio that feels like a place that we would want to work in all of the different ways, creatively, culturally, socially, et cetera.
So let's dive into that a little bit, because I think it's an interesting statement. I think it's true. I think within our generation, and even certainly the ones that are younger than us, there's much more of this feeling that, to put it simply, I think people are fed up, with some of the working environments that still exist today in architecture that are just brutal and they're very top down and all these things. So, but you say contemporary practice and looking toward the future. What specifically does that mean for you guys?
I think the core of it is looking at how we work together. And I think that the way in which we're approaching our practice is, in contrast to what you were mentioning, it's a bottom-up model. And for Clay and I, it's really important to enable and empower the entire team that we have to be engaged, to have authorship, to have autonomy, and to feel like the projects they are working on are their projects, and not that they are just doing a project for somebody else with someone else's name on it. And that bottom-up methodology is something that I don't see a lot of out in the world. But I think when we were initially starting West of West, we were looking not at architecture firms, but we were looking at creative agencies and other types of creative practices, non-architectural creative practices, to think about how can we create a business, an office, a studio that does not just mimic the status quo in a sense.
Yeah. I like that you used the word authorship, because that was going to be my next question. Is I think that for a lot of architects who start their own practice, there's many reasons to start a practice, but one of the most common ones is because they want to do their own work and have that satisfaction of kind of like what you get to do in school, which is you're the person, and you get to decide if it works, and it's great. If it sucks and you understand you own it. Was it difficult to, in a sense, give up some of the authorship once you guys started to grow and bring on employees and people, to have that bottom up approach? Because a lot of architects, they I can sense they can't give it up, even though maybe they want to, because they understand the things that we're talking about, but they just can't. They need to be there to micromanage.
Yeah, and I mean, I understand that. I hear that. It's something that occasionally I have to struggle with, but ultimately I think it's an ego issue, and I think that we need to really look at West of West as a brand, and not as a practice that's led by two people. And so I think the bottom up conversation comes in there. And I think that thinking about our studio as a brand and not as a kind of figurehead led practice is really the starting point. And I think that by doing that, you create the space and allow that authorship to happen. We didn't name it, Kumaran and Taylor, right? We didn't name it after ourselves. We didn't name it in acronyms. We were absolutely 100% against that and completely reject that as a kind of an antiquated model.
Yeah.
And so West of West is the result.
So a few questions on that. Could you expand what you mean by thinking about it as a brand? Because, and the context for that question is, I do think that there are a lot of architects, and maybe specifically a generation of architects, who, when they hear the word brand, it's icky. It's like, ew. That's a superficial thing. Architects should not be concerned with brands or aesthetics or something, or styles. And I'm not grouping all those together, but brand and branding has had, maybe still does, this kind of tainted.
Well, it has a consumer reputation.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Which I think is probably where it gets the taint from. But yeah,
it feels very commercial, or like you sold out.
Yeah, exactly.
In a sense. Yeah, my usage is much more broad in terms of how I'm thinking about brand. I'm thinking about brand more as a nebulous agency that creates things that people have an association with, right? And not necessarily as kind of a consumer-driven capitalist mechanism to sell shoes, right? So it's more about the association that one would have with West of West, and both externally, right? Like as a member of the public, you would hear about West of West and you understand generally who we are and what we do and the level of quality and what our ethos is. But I think also internally, it's equally as important to be thinking about it in that sense, because it removes the authorship from myself or from Clay or from anyone actually within the studio. And it broadens it into, hey, this is what West of West is working on, not, hey, this is a project that this one person is doing.
Yeah, I understand. I've always felt, and I think it could be argued both ways and to each their own, but I've always felt like that when an office is named after their founders, which, at a certain period of time, that was what everyone did. And this whole idea of like choosing a different word, like if you, I don't know, 30 years ago, or around that time said, I'm going to name my office this random name like Casper, they'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? Like, you're a weirdo is what you are. But I've always felt that when an office is named after the founder or founders, it gets, and assuming that office lasts for a long time, it gets weird. And there's almost an inherent or implicit feeling of that the vision of the studio is capped, that it can't, I think you used the word vague or amorphous when describing, I forget the word you just used, but it doesn't allow the office to kind of morph and evolve and to grow, stay true to its path, but still like shift as it needs to with time and with people. I mean, culture changes dramatically within the span of just a decade now. And I think when it's named after one person, things just, it becomes fixed. It almost has to become fixed because of that.
Yeah, it feels limited, right, in terms of how it could evolve. And I think the pace of change that we're starting to see, and I think that we're going to continue to see, for the next 40 plus years or however long we decide we want to keep practicing, I think the pace is just going to continue to increase.
Yeah. So how did you guys come up with the name West of West? Because it's a great name. Not awesome. All architecture offices have good names, I will say, but your guys, it's a good one.
Yeah. So the secret is that naming anything is really hard.
Oh yeah.
It's really, really challenging.
Yeah.
And we thought about it for a long time, and I kind of workshopped it together, and Clay and I, and it was very much a process. But ultimately, we were doing a little bit of reading and came across this quote by Teddy Roosevelt, who, when describing coming from the East Coast out to California, he was describing that when he goes to California, he's not going to the West, he's going west of the West. And that really resonated with us in terms of how we were thinking about our own work as something that is looking kind of out at a horizon, out into the distance, at something that you can't quite reach or achieve, but it takes kind of continual work to move towards it. And so West of West is an embodiment of that. But the narrative or the story of going to California and not going to the West, but west of the West, really, it just felt like the right thing. And so West of West is a product of that, and looking out into the horizon, into the future, eyes up, always looking forward. And that's where, that's what our DNA is.
Yeah, that's great. I like it.
So when did you decide to move to Oregon?
So the move to Oregon, or the kind of the expansion to Oregon, we have a studio in Los Angeles as well.
Gotcha.
The move up to Oregon was one where about 5 years into the practice, a lot of our friends, peer group, were talking about, and this is actually something that we studied a little bit at UCLA, but we're talking a lot about the kind of creative viability of secondary and tertiary urban centers in the US, and how we could have a creative practice, not in LA or New York or San Francisco or Chicago, but can you have a valid creative practice in other cities in the US? Obviously, the answer is yes, you can, and people do. But it was something that we felt like at that point in time, we were very, and both Clay and I, but also some of our friends and colleagues were feeling a little bit kind of trapped by LA or New York or whatever it was. So Portland, both for myself and my wife and Clay and his wife, made sense because we were able to kind of retain our kind of identity on the West Coast. And Portland has a really kind of inspiring creative community based on Nike, Adidas, White and Kennedy. There's a lot of really interesting creative agencies, non-architects here in Portland. So it kind of was the right fit in that sense. We moved to Portland and then realized that there's probably more architects per capita in Portland than other cities.
Seriously?
Yeah, it's a very architect dense city, I would say.
What? I would have not guessed that. That's super interesting.
So you moved there and you're like, oh, what the heck? I thought we were going to be west of everyone. What the heck? And they're all here already.
Yeah. We went from a small fish in a big pond to a small fish in a small pond, and had to kind of work our way through that, which we're doing, and it's a continued effort. But it also, I think, for the company, was a way of indicating that we are not necessarily tied to a local geography. And we are really interested in working regionally and nationally and in different cities and in different contexts. So I think it was also the move, Marina, was a response to not wanting to be an LA architect only working in LA.
I mean, that makes sense. And I think probably the two location kind of like keeps you guys in check in the work that you do, and kind of again like always makes you keep out, like looking outside of the box kind of thing.
Do you think, and do you find that being Portland based, how do I phrase this? That when clients find you, they understand because you're based in Portland and not one of the mega cities like LA or New York or San Francisco, that therefore they're more open to hiring you to doing work elsewhere, because it's like, well, they're in Portland, obviously they don't do work just in Portland. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that we position it is that we are operating out of and have a presence in LA and in Portland, and the dual city scenario gives us an ability to kind of be there for our clients, especially on the West Coast, wherever they need to be. So we have projects in Seattle, Portland, the Bay Area, LA. So we're able to kind of work kind of all the way through, and then we're following our clients to other cities and things like that.
Do you find that sorry, go ahead.
To answer your question, I don't see that too much. In our practice, at least.
Do you find that sometimes it's difficult to, I was going to say convince, but have clients believe that they can or should hire someone who's not local to where they are or where the project is? It
can be challenging. I think that the new era that we're in of, kind of post-pandemic remote work is making things easier on that front. And I think it's opening people's eyes to the fact that you can create things in different places while you're not kind of from that place. I do think that just the kind of the technical execution of our work does, in many cases, really encourage having people in that city to really understand it. At minimum, we're visiting, we're taking field trips, we're kind of understanding the context. But yeah, it's also something too, though, that we're not really chasing new work in cities that we don't have a presence in. So I'm not going to Las Vegas. Not that I would ever really go to Las Vegas to chase work, but we're not going to Las Vegas and saying, hey, we're an architect. You should hire us to do,
Yeah.
a building in Las Vegas, right? So we do still, I guess, find ourselves, or New York is a great example too. Like, I don't need to go to New York. There's plenty of great architects in New York. That's not where we're focused.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense.
Did you guys have a project where you thought this is us, this is who we are, this is what our work is about, this is kind of like this is the first project where we feel like we are onto what, the trajectory that we want to keep going?
I think that first Garrett Light project was really a good indicator for us personally of what we can do and what's important. Mm-hmm. I think we're always looking forward and into the future on projects. And I personally have I don't know about a hard time. I prefer looking at what's next versus looking at what has been. So I'm always kind of biased in that sense, in terms of where my views are focused. But I do think that initial Garrett Light store really was kind of a testament to, okay, cool, this works, right? We can do this. Mm-hmm. We can build something from this. The kind of ideas that we had were tested and were proved good. And this is something that we can continue with.
Talking about the office itself, how many people do you guys have now?
So there's Clay and I as the partners, and then we have 3 people in LA, and we have 4 people in Portland.
Okay,
currently.
Oh, cool.
Really cool. So one thing also is that practicing as a solopreneur, or in your case a duopreneur with 2 people, is very different when you're the only 2 and you're doing everything, to then growing to having 7 people or whatever the number was. Mm-hmm. Talk about that transition. If there was anything that was surprising, scary, different, when you guys started to grow and bring on people in a consistent way, because it's a big transition.
It is, and I think that the goal. I think generally at heart, I'm a generalist, and I tend to just operate in that way. And I think for Clay and I, the prospect of growing the practice was really exciting, because we would be able to, if we did it right, and I think we have done it right, bring on really, really talented people who can do things that I can't do, that we can't do. And so we've really, from day one, we've always had this ethos of, we are looking and hiring people who are better than we are, right? Yeah. Who can do things that we can't do. And I think that's so critical to enable us to do what we need to do personally, within the practice, but also to enable the practice at large to be successful. So that mentality or mindset has made it, I guess, easier to be able to grow internally in that sense. Yeah. I think that the growth happened slowly. We were generally hiring 1 person per quarter, so 4 people per year. Mm-hmm. And so we were able to scale and grow. And we were bigger a couple years ago, and then we've kind of shrank a little bit. And so we kind of fluctuate, and we try to be agile and nimble and adaptable. But we grew slowly enough in terms of people that we were able to kind of figure out how to do it along the way.
Yeah.
Right. Versus if you started, if we started and then we hired 20 people, we would have no idea what to do. Right. Yeah. It would be a complete disaster.
Yeah. I think the chances of things working out long term would become a lot lower. But you hear it though, because offices who do larger size projects, and like in our case, we do mostly houses, like not single family houses and not small shops, but larger things. They win a project through a competition, and the competition entry was done by two people on their own laptops or computers, as it happens. You submit it, you win it, and suddenly now you have to hire like 25 people to do this thing. And that's a not uncommon story. And on the one hand, that sounds very seductive. On the other hand, it sounds crazy. Like, what does it feel like as an employee to jump into to build a brand new ship and just start going? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it would be a big leap of faith, and many practices are coming as a kind of a splinter group from another firm.
Mm-hmm.
So they're kind of taking people from there, and there's already kind of a working relationship as they, the first original kind of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people. But we didn't have that. That wasn't the approach that we took. But yeah, I totally agree with you that just having 20 people right off the bat would be, for me would be really challenging, but B, I think for the employees, for the people, the team, I think it would also be really challenging. I mean, it just takes time to get all of the things that enable us to, both attract talent and retain talent set up in a way that makes sense, so, healthcare and HR systems and kind of all that banal thing, the kind of operational things that are almost table stakes for joining a bigger company that already has it all figured out.
Yeah.
At one point in time, we didn't have all those things figured out. Now we do. And I think it makes it easier for people to just kind of come in and get set up and get going. Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I feel like if you joined an office and there's 20 of you joining at once, and you went from 2 people to 22, it would just be
you can
chaos.
feel it too. You can feel like your bosses don't know what they're doing, and
running around, just chickens with their heads cut off. What are we doing today? I don't know. Draw something. Draw fast.
Yeah.
The other aspect of that the topic though is, from your own perspective or as an individual, being the person who's designing things, like the skill to design something in many ways is very different from the skill set required to lead a group of people. Again, convince them to come work for you, find the right fit, have them stay with you and nurture them and all of that kind of stuff. And you guys have taken it at probably the correct or slower pace. What are some things, throughout that transition that you realized for yourself that were important, or did you always have kind of an innate, knack for, I could call it leadership?
I think I don't know if I had an innate sense for it, but I do think that it's something that, for me personally, was something that continues to be a practice. It continues to be something that I am working on and kind of looking back at decisions and things that we have done or I have done from a leadership standpoint, and continually trying to think about how do we do this better? How do we improve on this? And so I think, whatever level or set of experiences that you have as as someone starting a practice, I think as long as you are aware and trying to improve on how you lead, I think you'll be all right, right? You'll be in good shape as long as you are aware that you have an obligation to set a stage for your employees to do the best work that they can do. And ultimately, that's my goal when I get up every morning, is to provide a platform, to provide a space for each one of our designers to do the best work that they can do. And so all of my kind of decisions are revolving around that.
Do you guys, if the work comes, do you guys want to get larger? I mean, have more people?
We've been talking a lot about this. I think it's a really challenging. Growth is a strange thing, and it's something where there's some. In some ways, it's very seductive, but in others, it becomes a little bit less appealing. But I do think that generally, for us, we're focused on quality over quantity. And so that applies to projects specifically, in that we're really looking at improving the level of quality, and we're not really focused on growth specifically in that sense.
Sure. Sure.
So if it happened and we could do it in the way that made sense and we still retained kind of the core of what West of West is, absolutely. But for me, it would be a nightmare if we all of a sudden were 100 people and it wasn't what we have now, which we have, Clay teaches at University of Oregon.
Oh, good school.
I'll sit on jury panels and things like that, but we'll have students come into to the office, either this one or the one in LA, and they're inspired because it feels like a design studio. And that's why I continually use the word studio. And it's a place that people come together to make things. And if we grew for whatever reason, profit, projects, and we lost that, it would have, I would have failed at my job.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that the idea behind studio as you've described it, because, and this also touches back on the idea of top down versus bottom up, that first of all, I think there are a lot of creative practices, architects and others, who when they, let's say they're being interviewed or when they're giving a tour of their studio, their office studio to a client or to whoever else, the things that they're saying, that the message they put out there is we're bottom up. No one has, enclosed desks. It's very, what do they say? Like rhizomatic? No, what is it? The whatever
Horizontal.
Fancy word that we're all equals on the same plane together. And this is how we do things. And, I've been in offices where I hear that speech being given. I'm like, that's not the case. Like that's bullshit. I know we're all sitting in an open floor plan concept, in quotes, concept, but that's not what's happening here. And I think, anyway, that's a long way of saying, I think that takes place. I think it's also it's much more difficult than people think to sort of capture the lightning of the academic studio, bottle it, and have it take place in a practicing studio. I think that is less common than I wish it was.
I think it is, and I think that when I'm in the studio and we have guests come, I've never pointed at work on the wall and said, my project or I designed this or anything. That's definitely not where Clay and I are coming from. And I think harnessing the kind of lightning in a bottle that you're describing, it really is, it is a process, and it takes work to continually think about what is the atmosphere that we are creating, to enable the team to have those experiences and to come up with the work that they're coming up with. We're not always successful. We fail sometimes at that, but that's part of that learning and part of that process. As an example, we recently did a whole day where we flew the LA team up to our Portland studio, took a whole day off, no client projects, no client work. We all sat together and we did a whole work session on process. And we talked about process in all of the different facets and ways that we work just together. And each person, each kind of team of people had something that they were bringing to the table to talk about. And we had a 6 or 8 hour discussion about how we work as a means of getting better at what we do. And we talked about creative briefs. We talked about sketching and modeling and image making, drawing, building. So we touched on all those things broadly as a way of creating an environment where, like a studio, you're learning. And if you stop learning, and if I stop creating opportunities for the team to learn, then I think you start to move from a studio to an office.
Right. Aside from your capacity and what you do, the both of you do as the leaders, is the most challenging part and the hardest part making sure that you have the right people? Because at your scale, 4-person or 3-person per location, it's like hypercritical. Every person matters immensely. I don't mean in terms of production, but in terms of the chemistry and the personality and their willingness to partake in those kinds of discussions that you described. If you have one bad apple or someone who does not a bad apple, just not the right fit, then it doesn't work. So, I guess the question is that hard to find or to be a magnet to the right people and make sure that chemistry is taking place?
Yeah, it's definitely something that's immensely critical in how we work in a studio environment. And over the years, I've started to understand some of the things that I look for as I'm talking with people, to understand how they would fit within what we do. And I think that has given me a sense of, I can kind of figure out pretty quickly if it would make sense. I think for me, the biggest thing that I'm looking for are not skills based, they're traits based. And so it's people that are curious and they're engaged. And if you are curious about something and you want to learn about something, everything else can be taught essentially, right? To some extent. And so that's kind of the baseline of thinking about how the team is made up. And we have every single person has, at West has those traits where they're curious about something, they ask questions, they dig deeper. And then all of the technical things are things that we can learn, and we can, people bring in things from their previous roles and add to the studio. But you're right. It's a very critical part of who we are.
Yeah. It's an interesting thing because a lot of it comes down also to timing. And I don't want to go too much into this because I want to talk about your guys' work, but yeah. It's an odd thing, like from an employee's perspective, when you're applying to places, I'm always talking to students and they're always asking for tips and things. I'm like, the first thing is it's sort of out of your control. It's timing. If you need a job ASAP and the three offices you want to work at are not hiring, not even close to hiring, then it just ain't going to happen at now. Maybe a few years from now it'll take place. And the reverse is true also for the employers. If we're looking to hire and
right.
like we needed someone the next few months, and that perfect individual is not at that point in their lives yet, it's just not going to happen. So I don't know what that means exactly, but it's an intriguing thing that a lot of it is just timing, really.
It is, and it's kind of that like right place, right time. For both sides. But I do think that if, as an employee or potential employee, as a designer, as an architect, looking to go work at a place that you kind of have fallen in love with, at least from the outside, there is a definitely, it's a valid approach to continue to want to work at that place, at least to try it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And if you're passionate about it, not to just kind of settle for, well, I guess I need to take this job because, that's forever. Obviously everybody needs to eat and pay their rent, but the job that you take to do that doesn't necessarily have to be the final place that you work, nor is it the only expression of architecture or the practice of architecture. So there's so many different places to work for so many different types of firms. And that's something when we have our summer interns at the end of their summer, we always sit down and have a conversation. And that's part of the conversation is that, look, my role as in what I do is giving you exposure as a student, essentially, to what we do as a small practice, and it might resonate and it might be a good fit, but also at the same time, you might think, hey, I need more structure. I need more kind of, I want to go work at SOM. Sure. That's amazing. Right. But my job is to give you some exposure as a student, as a young professional into, what you what you could do. One option.
Yeah. One of many different colors of the rainbow and flavors of
so many options.
Skittles. The talking about the work itself, so your guys' work is phenomenal. One question I did have is, do you find that by working on a variety of projects that there is, kind of, call them lessons learned, which is kind of a lame way of putting it, but lessons learned from one type that get applied to other design problems you face in other types of projects?
I mean, I think there's kind of two ways to answer that. I think one of the responsibilities that we have is to be communicators and to be able to communicate our designs to our clients. And so I think we're really, and every client is different, but trying to learn from all projects, how best to communicate and which ways that communication is successful, visual, written, whatever it might be, and use that as a way to kind of apply the lessons learned to future projects. I do think that one of the things, and this is something that we're building up, but is a robust QA/QC process, and that is something that most small offices don't really have, just because there's not kind of a structure set up to do that. But the focus on, as I was mentioning earlier, the focus on quality for us as a studio is one that, we really need to start looking at that process as part of our workflow more specifically. I think that one of the things really broadly though is understanding, and this is such a foundational thing, but understanding what client is a good fit for West of West, and what client maybe is a better fit for another practice. And I have a hard time with this. Clay has a hard time with this. We're working on it. It's part of that learning, but really being in a position to understand what a good project outcome is going to be in the very early stages, and kind of trying to forecast what that is by way of thinking about the client and why they're coming to West of West, and why do they want to work with us, and why do we want to work with them. So that the formation of that why, again, to go all the way back is really key to the initial parts of deciding whether to accept a project or not.
Do you guys ever just ask the client during the initial interviewing process, why are you talking to us? Or why would you hire with? Yeah.
I think that's a totally valid question to be asking. And sometimes the answers are, well, we want someone that's young and can maybe have maybe more innovative approach to a project, so it's different than the building next door. Sometimes it's just more about, hey, we enjoy working together. We enjoy working with you and your team. And I've found that a lot of our success has been very much on the kind of personal relationship level with our clients. We all, I think, want to work with people that we enjoy working with, right? Day to day.
Yeah.
So, if we can find, just like we talked about finding people for the team, for the studio, finding clients for the studio in the same way, I think is equally important. So we have the same values, same goals, kind of somewhat of a similar kind of way of viewing the world, things like that. That all really helps getting us to a place where the project feels very successful.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's an interesting thing because that is probably one of the toughest, everything's tough in architecture, but one of the toughest parts about what we do, and this extends to other creative practices too, is trying to determine as best as you can whether or not the client and the project is a good fit for you and where you're at currently. Is really difficult to do because, I don't know what it's like for you guys and the types of projects you do, but for us, sometimes it's just a few conversations and that's all we have with the client before we sign on and we go. And I'm always of this mindset. I'm always of this feeling that it's hard to do it, but I would love to spend like 3 hours with a client in multiple sessions each, 3 hours each, to understand them and then to decide to whether or not to take on a project that's going to last 2 years, 2.5 years, 3 years of my life. But the reality is that a lot of clients and a lot of people, understandably, are not going to do that. They don't have the time, and they don't want to spend the time, and they probably don't fully understand why it's so critical for us to try and squeeze as much information from them as possible about the project, about their life, about their ideas, about everything. I want the most information you can give me, the more the better. And it's never quite enough, and it never will be for practical reasons. But I think, anyway, this question of trying to vet clients and within the reality of a concise period of time, that's something we're always thinking about and trying to problem solve.
Well, and I feel also that for maybe the types of projects that you guys do, it might be even harder, because for us, we design homes for people. So if we get an idea of their personality and who they are, we kind of like maybe have an idea of how they're going to be able to make decisions and their taste and all of those things. But if you work with, let's say, a store, a brand, or other types of project, it's not so much of personal decisions. So you might not know where the decisions come from or how it's been, thought about.
Yeah.
There's definitely a lot of challenges with that you both are describing. And I face the same challenges to a certain degree. And I think we have worked on a number of homes over the years, and they have proven to be challenging in that you sometimes have kind of a shifting playing field of what the client is looking for and what side of the bed they woke up on and how they're related to one another. Say there's 2 or 3 clients, whatever it is, or family. So each kind of typology almost has its own set of challenges from a client standpoint that we need to, as architects, figure out where we fit into it. I think by way of example, we have a number of really incredible clients, and there's the old saying that like a great project happens because there's a great client is mostly true. I would say, as architects, we can be as incredibly talented and visionary as we all can be. But if the client isn't there along with you, it just doesn't work. So we're very fortunate to have a number of really incredible clients that are enabling us to do the work that we're doing. Looking into the future, we have a few hotels that we're working on that we're really excited about. Some infill housing projects that we're really excited about. We're working on a winery right now where the client is just like such a trusting, incredible individual. And the outcome when clients are like that is phenomenal, because they give you kind of the authorship and license to go and do what you're trained to do. So we've been really fortunate in that sense to have clients that do trust us. Yeah. And it's a trust it is a relationship, right? It is a trust that's built over time, and you have to continually kind of earn it and prove it.
No, you're right. It's a two-way relationship, that creative relationship. So like you said, like if you're really talented, but the other side doesn't get it, it's not going to go very far, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
But if they do get it, then you could go like way beyond what everybody imagined you could achieve, which, those are the best projects. Talking about that, and not to go back on my business plan question, but do you have
obsessed
kind
with
of
a business plan?
No.
Let's do this. Let's work on one together. Let me get some paper.
I actually hate the name business plan. It just freaks me out. But like, where do you see the office in the next 10 years? Since you guys are, close to your 10-year anniversary, like where?
These are big questions.
Well, no, but like, is there?
Yeah.
Are you just taking it day by day and kind of like seeing like where the sale is leading you, or is there like things that you have in mind that you would want the office to achieve and get to?
The kind of the business of architecture or practice it's a very, at least in my experiences, it's a very slow moving vessel. So kind of turning it and moving it in a direction takes, months, if not years. or it can, I guess, depending on how you approach it. Obviously, there's many different ways to do it. But looking into the future for West of West, we're really, really focused on leaning into the quality over quantity, like I mentioned, and then also really in that looking at projects that are more explicitly experiential, and in a few different categories there that we're really excited about. The housing projects that we're working on are proving to be really both well received, but also I think there's some really incredible ideas embedded within those. The next kind of hurdle that we have is to start to build those and see those ideas come to life. So we're really focused on that. And then in addition to the housing, this idea of kind of experientiality and thinking about how someone experiences architecture, looking at hotels and wineries and other hospitality projects as a really exciting way to be able to explore, our own kind of design thinking and really kind of engage in a positive way with the public at large as they go and visit a hotel or a winery or a brewery or other kind of hospitality led projects. And I think the other kind of factor is, looking into the future, continuing to both improve externally the projects that we're working on, the clients that we're working with, the level that we're delivering at, but also really focusing on continuing to build a really positive studio environment for the team. And at whatever scale that is, 20 people, 40 people, whatever it might be, really making sure that we have a internal studio culture that really enables the team to be doing the best work that they can do. I'm completely committed to that as a goal, and excited by thinking about new ways of figuring out how to do that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And you might have already answered this question, but is there one project that you guys have not done yet that you personally would really, really love to do?
I think very long term for me personally, just because of my background, both in architecture, but also in the art world, I really, really want to be moving into a space of working on galleries and, ultimately, if we were talking way in the future, me at 80 years old working on a museum. It doesn't really honestly matter what the scale is, but that world of designing spaces for art and the public to view art or experience art is really, really, for me personally, an exciting place to be looking towards.
Cool. The final question I have, which I always ask, is what is your favorite building?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask this question.
People know now, but it's still
the field of architecture with your question.
Can I give you three?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and then the top one.
Okay. I have three, and I think that these three for me really represent what I believe architecture can do, and they're three at totally different kind of scales. But the first is growing up, we had a family cabin in the mountains in the Sierra Nevadas on a lake. And that was not capital A architecture. It was built by my great uncle in the 1920s, I think. But it's a pure emotional state that is so clear to me that I can recall it without even trying. It's the temperature, it's the view, it's the quality of the light. It's just such a clear memory. And I think that what West of West is aspiring to do is part of, it's part of that. So this family cabin is one of my three. The second is the Sea Ranch Chapel, which I mentioned earlier. And I'm mentioning that here in this context because it was at its core a collaboration between an artist, Jim Hubble, and a craftsman who was my dad. And I think that for me personally, in my own practice, I'm trying to kind of be both of those things at the same time. Sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully. But I think that that's, to me, really, really a North Star. And then the third, I'll give you the classic one, but is Corb's La Tourette.
Oh, yeah.
And it's I think a Dominican monastery in France. It was his last building that he completed in Europe in 1960. And I visited it 15 years ago, probably. And it's really a phenomenal building in the way that he was dealing with light as a means of shaping space and experience. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like he started with a dark thing, a dark space, and then kind of very carefully added light to it, which to me was really inspiring. And on top of that, and I think you can still do this today, but you can stay there. Yeah. And you can rent a room, and you can stay in one of the friars. I think they call them cells, which is a little bit ominous, but you can stay in one of the friars' rooms or quarters. And so I did that when I was living in Europe for a little bit, and it was a really phenomenal experience. And it was a piece of kind of classic architecture that moves you. And so if we were gonna make it 3 buildings, those would be the 3.
Well, they're really good ones.
Yeah, those are great buildings. Yeah. And anyone who doesn't know the chapel, you should look it up. It's pretty wild, that chapel. It's pretty phenomenal. And La Tourette is great too. I've seen it in person, but I wasn't able to stay there overnight. But I'm sure that obviously my experience of it would have been very different and greater had I been able to stay there. It's kind of an odd thing, actually, when you visit buildings as we do. Go on vacation, all you do is visit buildings. Yeah, It's it takes like a full day at least, almost, to come close to understanding what the building is trying to do or is doing. And it's kind of a shame sometimes you only have half an hour or even a few hours. Even feels like it's too short.
Especially if you're on a tour and they keep like kicking you around and you just want to absorb the space, you know?
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Jai, this was fantastic. Thanks so much for making the time on a morning to chat with us. Let's do it again in the future. And thanks for being on the show.
That sounds great. Thank you both. It was great to be here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for watching this video on YouTube. If you like what we're doing, then please support our show by hitting that subscribe button and liking and commenting on our videos.
You can also find us on most of the social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're mostly on Instagram. And you can reach out to the hotline, 213-222-6950. You can send a text message or leave a voicemail. If you have any reaction to this recording, any questions you might have, or guest suggestion, feel free to send it our way.
Cool. Thank you for watching, and see you next week.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.